All right, everybody. We're going to do some more stories now. This is called Mountain Tales and River Stories. All right. This is written by Pete Koski. All right. If you want to do some more research into it, I encourage it. The first story we're going to do is called A Wolf of Evenings. All right. So let's get started, y'all. It was late October when Wolf Trap Hamrick rode his mule down to the crossroads and trading post on the outskirts of Fork Lick on the back fork of Elk River. His heavy-soled boots echoed on the hollow floors as he walked up to the counter and laid down the dried mangy scalps. There were 16 of them in all, and every one a wolf. The proprietor anticipated Hamrick's business with a sense of trepidation, for the hunter was a dark, solitary figure whose very presence made one feel guarded and uneasy. An unspoken sense of violence emanated from the man, for after all, he made his living killing wolves for bounty, and hide hunters were violent by nature. People whispered that he had killed more than just wolves in his 20-odd years on the elk. He traded the scalps for powder, caps, lead, yeast, sugar, coffee, and tobacco, and left the room without a word. The owner watched from the window as the wolf killer slowly loaded his saddlebags, mounted his mule, and rode off as silent and foreboding as he came. Nige Wolf Trap Hamrick lived in a dank, sway-backed cabin deep in the woods up on Point Mountain. He had long shunned the society of the settlements. His needs were basic and simple, and he stubbornly, perhaps even unconsciously, clung to the old ways of his frontier forebears. His principal possessions were traps, a still, and an old mountain rifle. A series of limestone caves near the cabin provided a clandestine hideaway for his whiskey making. A nearby spring provided abundant water. Strategically placed steel traps were set near the still to protect it from intruders, and he positioned a sawed-off musket equipped with a tripwire as a second defense. He was never seen without his rifle. It was a long-barreled, iron-mounted muzzleloader. His pouch and horn were always hanging over his ragged coat. There was an old copper .44 Henry shell casing tied to a thong on his powder horn that he used for a powder measure. He generally loaded 2 shell casings worth of powder for a normal load, but he would double the measure if he planned on killing a bear. Though most men of any means would jump at the chance to get their hands on a modern smokeless repeater or a breakdown shotgun, Nige still clung to the muzzleloader. It suited his needs, and although he claimed he didn't trust them cartridges, he was just too tight to buy a modern gun. Nige came by wolfing honestly. He learned to hunt and trap from his grandfather, who had been among the group of men who had killed the last buffalo in Webster County back in 1820. He smelled of hides and death. His old clothes were rank with the scent of wolf skulls he boiled down and placed on pikes at various points in the forest near his cabin to mark his territory. The smell of his abode would surely gag any town dweller who might happen to chance upon his place. But to Nige, it was the only smell he knew. The still produced whiskey that was rough and raw, but served its intended purpose. He was well acquainted with the pay schedule at the surrounding lumber camps, and his mule loaded down with heavy saddlebags was a welcome sight to the thirsty woodhicks who would pay whatever Nige asked regardless of how rough and raw the product. Wolf Trap was not a man open to negotiation. He had worked at lumber camps years before he took up wolfing and had courted a local girl, nearly marrying her. When a particular tract of woods was cut and a job was finished, the camp would often sponsor a dance for the woodhicks and invite the locals. Nige was a tall, young, black-eyed dandy when he danced all night with a striking, blue-eyed, auburn-haired girl of 16 named Polly McClung. The timberjacks gathered in the shadows, laughing and passing jugs of moonshine, or sat on piles of scrap lumber near the dance floor rolling cigarettes. The ground was stained with tobacco juice and sawdust as the musicians played and the woodhicks swung their partners, their heavy spiked boots stirring up the dust. Young Eden Hammonds and Uncle John McIlwain played with cross-tuned fiddles, while a young Negro boy thumped on a gut-strung banjo with a deer hide head. Nige's heart was light as he swung her round and round to lively, skirling reels. Their eyes sparkled in the lamplight, their faces flushed with the energy and passion only found in the young. They courted for a time, and she agreed to marry. Nige found his young heart at peace with the world. He attacked his work in the lumber wood with a new passion and vitality that he had not known was possible. Whether he was chopping with a double-bitted axe or taking his turn on the crosscut saw, he welcomed the labor, knowing that every dollar he earned would go toward a new life with his pretty Polly. Then, just as Nige was beginning to get truly used to the idea of a settled married life, she left him. He walked up on the porch of the McClung family cabin to find her mother in a rocker stringing beans. Her downcast face and fey demeanor caused his heart to sink and his mind to whirl. He knew Polly was gone. She had run off with a traveling axe salesman who often passed through the lumber camps on a regular circuit. Alone and dejected, betrayed and angry, he thereafter took to the solitude of the mountains and wrought out his revenge not on man, but on wolves. For a time, in the deepest depths of his despair, he vowed to kill anyone he came across in hopes of somehow assuaging the bitterness bred from the broken vow. In those days, the lumber camps were moving villages that always attracted itinerants of every shade and stamp, both good and bad. The men lived in what amounted to rolling bunkhouses affixed to rail cars. The camp was always alive with the sights and sounds and excitement of any operation that involved large numbers of young men employed in a very physical, dangerous vocation. Heaps of scrap wood littered the periphery. The odor of coal smoke from the steam engines blended with the smell of fresh bark and raw earth. The constant cacophony of industrial noise often was augmented by an occasional brawl among the men, or loud crows from fighting cocks and other penned-up fowl behind the cook shack. On any given day, next to the woodhicks themselves, the camps were havens to all sorts of travelers and hangers-on. There were Jewish peddlers, hucksters and snake oil men, black drought men, bands of gypsies, the inevitable prostitute, moonshiners selling corn liquor, hunters selling a variety of wild game from trout to wild turkeys to deer hams, locals offering heaps of ramps in the spring along with sorghum, honey, and ginseng, washerwomen, and of course traveling preachers. One such circuit rider who considered the salvation of woodhicks to be his mission in life was the preacher Black. Raised in the mountains and known to be fiercely passionate in his beliefs to the point of fanaticism, Black was an old widower who had married late in life and lost his young wife in childbirth. His teenage daughter Sarah traveled with him and always sat in the first row, led the singing, and passed the plate. He carried his Bible in a canvas sack, tied over the pommel of his saddle, and a Colt Navy revolver under his coat. The revolver was new when he was a young man back in bloody Kansas, when he rode alongside John Brown, whose zealous abolitionists fought Senator David Rice Atkinson's Missourians in what turned out to be the prelude to the war between the states. He naturally gravitated back east to serve in the Grand Army of the Republic in what he considered his personal war to end the institution of slavery. Years after the war, he found himself married, widowed, the father of a child, and a self-appointed minister to the mountain folk and woodhicks of his native land. A few weeks after red-haired Polly left Nige for another, the preacher found the woodhick in the mud behind the revival tent crying drunk. Sensing an opportunity for healing and salvation, the preacher fed the young man, and over steaming cups of strong coffee eventually got Nige to tell him his troubles. Nige told the preacher about Polly and the darkness that he felt in his soul. He told how he had often taken his anger out on the wolves of the forest, somehow using them as a scapegoat for his anger at the girl. Preacher Black understood scapegoats and anger and offered his advice. "Son, I reckon the Lord makes two kinds of men in the world, those who create and those who destroy. Now I can see that you're troubled, alone, and afflicted. You look like you're sitting the fence on whether you want to be a creator or destroyer. I'd like to believe that you want to create. That is, create a good life for yourself, a useful life. Even find a good woman and create children. Create a life that will honor your Creator. But be careful, son, because if you choose to be a destroyer, the very thing you seek to destroy will one day destroy you. It's a lonesome valley you must walk. No one else can make the decision for you, to create or to destroy. There's just something wrong about destroying one of God's creatures, no matter how vile they may seem to be to you. Now, I worked much of my life to destroy the evil of slavery, but slavery was not created by God, but by man. And not all men create to honor God. Some create for the satisfaction of their own sin, such as those who create liquor or those who created slavery. Nige nodded slowly at the preacher's words and replied, "But Preacher Black, you may say those woodhicks are destroying the trees that God created. What about that?" "I see your point, son, but those trees will make lumber boards to build churches and schoolhouses where children will learn to read so they can read God's Word. Those trees will create pulp and paper so that God's Word may be printed and bound not only in the form of books, but bound in the hearts of men as well. Just like the New Englanders kill the great leviathans of the deep in order to produce oil for lamps, so that the Bible may be read long after the setting of the sun. So you timbermen are doing brave and noble work in the service of the Lord, even if many of you act in ungodly ways. You are creating the very template upon which the good book is written." Nige asked the preacher to pray over him and told the preacher how he would that day swear off liquor and ask for guidance for his uncertain future. He would forgive Polly and try to live a more godly life. He would no longer kill the wolves, and he would take a new sense of pride in his work, now knowing that felling trees would be pleasing to the Lord. They shook hands, and for all that season, Nige worked with a lighter heart, intent on only destroying the trees of the earth and none of its living things. Sometimes, even the most stringent of vows can be forgotten in an instant of passion or sudden fancy. Such was the fate of Nige Hamrick's vows to Preacher Black the following spring, when he found that Polly had returned to her family. The word around the lumber camp was that she was back living at her mother's cabin, and she had a child. Her salesman husband had left her, and she had nowhere else to go. She got a job taking in washing for the lumber company, and some said she was even doing favors for the railroad men, as evidenced by a new pair of pretty little shoes she took to carrying to work, only to put on when she was away from the mud. One night Nige spotted her on the corner of the cookhouse near the corduroy road with a dram glass in her hand, laughing with one of the firemen who worked the narrow gauge railroad that was recently built into the mountainside. The thirst for liquor and revenge was soon too much for Nige. It was while walking home one dark evening down the muddy road on her weary trek that she encountered a drunk and disturbed Nige Hamrick. At first she acted glad to see him. She told him she was sorry she had not married him and how foolish she was for leaving him for a virtual stranger. In the darkness, she could not see the contorted face, the furrowed brow of anger, the small clasped knife in his right hand. Without a word, he took pretty Polly by the hand and led her off the beaten path and into the wood. She started to scream and run in protest, but his massive hands were at her mouth, cupping away the muffled sobs. High above them, a barred owl watched the scene in silence. Later, the owl watched as only one of the humans returned from the wood. The days of being a creator for Nige Hamrick were over. From then on, he was a destroyer. After Polly, he left the timber camp and before long had built his cabin on Point Mountain. Soon after came the still and the full-time wolf hunting. Nige, cradling his rifle and riding his black mule, Lucifer, became a familiar sight to the people of Fort Lick. He was always given a wide berth on the road, not only due to the smell, but also the wild look in his eyes. Even his very shadow seemed evil and unforgiving. One year, a revenuer got wind of Nigel's whiskey making and sought him out. Though warned to leave Nige be by the locals, he was young, persistent, and cocky. And if there was an art to becoming an old revenuer, it was an art this man did not possess. He was never seen again. He surely almost found the still, for the following spring 2 boys were fishing below Point Mountain and found part of a grown man's booted leg held fast in a giant bear trap attached to a section of chain. It's possible the revenuer had become wolf bait. The trap had somehow been wrenched from its moorings, probably by wolves, and had been dragged down the mountain to the river. That was the last time anyone dared inquire about Nigel's still. As Nige grew older, he began to give thought to what he might do should he actually trap out all the wolves. The tally had reached into the hundreds over the years, and lately he had seen very few. A full moon no longer conjured up the eerie howls and lonely yelps that had been heard mere years ago. Though he didn't realize it, he had begun drinking more of his homemade liquor than he was selling. He began walking the mountain at night with his rifle, pouch and horn, skinning knife and jug of shine. He would howl at the empty sky to try and call up the wolf pack. More often than not, the only reply was the raspy notes of a barred owl or two. He would drink and slobber and howl like a demon throughout the night, and wake twisted and wet with the morning dew at the base of a gnarled oak, or in the tall grass on a bald spot on the mountain. By late autumn, he had gone for weeks with no wolves in his traps. He had taken a number of bobcats and foxes, but not a single wolf. He wondered if perhaps they were all finally gone. Then one evening, on his way back to the cabin, he spotted a single track in the soft sand near a small creek bed. It was not a particularly large track, but that of a grown wolf nonetheless. The familiar wolf fever began to return, and he adjusted his trap line accordingly, hoping for at least one last wolf, if not more. That night he walked out of his cabin to take the air, chewing on a cold piece of hoe cake. The distant ridge lines were obscured and blended into the gray sky as an early snow began to fall, and covering the surrounding hills, his smoky breath dissipated into the cold night air. As he stood in the dim light on the open cabin door, within a roaring fire burned in the fireplace, and bright sparks shot out of the top of the mud-chinked chimney. As he turned to go back inside, he heard a faint, lonely howl, barely audible through the heavy atmosphere of the snowfall. He found the wolf the next morning. She was caught in the trap by the creek bed and still alive. He approached her slowly and immediately noticed her emaciated frame and mangy coat. There were great bald patches on her hide, and her spindly rat-like tail was nearly barren of fur. Her teeth were all gone, and it was apparent that she was nearly starved to death. The she-wolf looked toward Nige with glazed, unseeing eyes that were pitiful to behold. She was too weak to snap at him or even growl. As he slowly approached with careful steps, Nige brushed the snow off of a large rock and sat down with the butt of his rifle between his feet. He rested his elbows on his knees and held the rifle upright between his hands, resting the side of his head against the long barrel as he contemplated the dying wolf. "Is that what I've spent my life a-killing all these years?" he thought to himself. Wolves were supposed to be evil, deadly creatures that strike fear in the hearts of men, yet this wolf was anything but. Perhaps the wolf's eyes implored him to finish what he had started. He sat with the wolf for what seemed like a long time, both silently aware of the other's presence, each somehow knowing that they were both the last of their race. At length he rose and found a nearby chunk of deadfall. To use a club, he dispatched the wolf with a clout on the head, not wishing to waste a load of powder and ball on the poor beast. That night he sat before his fireplace thinking about the wolf he had killed. He somehow knew in his heart that this had been the last wolf. He thought of his grandfather and how he had helped kill the last buffalo over 70 years before. He thought of the few elk he had heard bugle in the fall as a child, never to see one himself. From his pocket, he took a small flint bird point he had found years ago and always carried. His eyes scanned the fresh wolf scalp on the nearby table where it lay beside a single smoky tallow candle. The light from the fire flickered on the bird point in his hand. Nige muttered to himself, "Buffler's all gone, the Injuns all gone, elk's all gone, now the wolves are all gone. I reckon I'll be gone soon." Suddenly a great feeling of loneliness and melancholy fell over him. He thought of his wasted life. The words to a song he had heard in the lumber camps came to his mind, and the meaning took hold like never before. "It's lonesome here, it's lonesome all the time, lonesome on this cherry river line." Though always a solitary man, for the first time in his life, Nige felt truly alone. The passing of the final wolf brought a new reality to his life. In the past, he had always had the wolves. They had been his reason to exist. Now that they were gone, he was truly alone. He thought of Polly and how his life could have been so different had she not left him when she did. If he had not taken her life, perhaps she would have taken him back. Another verse of the song made him think of her even more, and he trembled at the memory. Now she's standing on the corner with a dram glass in her hand, drinking away her troubles and courting another man. He reached for his tin cup of whiskey and muttered and talked to himself until he fell asleep by the fire. In the weeks after he had killed the last wolf, winter settled in with deep snow and long dark nights. Winter was the prime trapping season, and Nige would normally stay busy with the trap line. The killing of the last wolf had changed him somehow, and he left his traps unattended since that day. He spent his days huddled in the dark cabin, staring into the spitting earth with a bearskin draped over his shoulders, leaving only to shoot a deer or gather firewood. He drank more, and a deep depression came over him. Formerly a physically robust man, his body began to shrink. His skin was taut over his bony, sinewy frame. His eyes lost their sharp glint and appeared hollow and sunken in his skull. Nige Hamrick had become a ghostly shell of his former self. Sometimes at night he would pour pitch in the hollowed wolf skulls that circled his cabin on pikes and light them up to burn bright while he would dance and howl in the flickering light. It was one such drunken winter's night when Nige was dancing beneath the full moon in the glow of the burning skulls that the wolves returned. The sound was unmistakable. A large wolf pack on the prowl, just like the old days, and moving fast his way. Soon the hellish torches revealed the glowing eyes and sinewy limbs of not a dozen or a score, but hundreds of bony wolves with their tongues hanging sideways from their wicked canines. Nige lifted his gun and fired at the alpha male and watched as the ball went right through the body as if it were a light mist and kicked up black earth in the frozen, snowy ground. The shot did not even register with this lupine specter or his pack. As he madly swirled around in a crooked arc, seeking to escape the oncoming attack, his fevered brain raced backward in time as the pack closed in around him. McIlwain's mortal fiddle sang in his ears. He was grasping Polly's waist, swinging her round and round in the dance, his knife piercing her heart between the short ribs and the long, the owl watching his return from the killing ground. Preacher Black's words resonated over the fiddle. The very thing you seek to destroy will one day destroy you. Then he saw the revenuer's leg in the trap, wolf skulls boiling in his pot. The fiddle hit a sour drone that morphed into the thunderous howls of 1,000 translucent wolves that screamed for vengeance as the pack closed in for the last time. Nige never made it back to the cabin before the ghosts of all the wolves he had killed and skinned and boiled and scalped knocked him down like a falling forest giant in an ancient stand. They tore him apart limb by limb, gnawed his bones, and devoured him in the shadows of the silent moon. Later that night, the shadow of a low-flying owl passed over his meager remains. It was a year before anyone realized Nige was gone. The people of Fork Lick instinctively knew that the wolves were also gone. They thought it queer that Nige had stopped riding off the mountain soon after the last wolf had been trapped out. No one went up on Point Mountain near where Nige was known to live for fear of his traps. That summer, a traveling preacher passed through Fork Lick and held a service. He was no stranger to the settlement and inquired about various acquaintances. When he asked about the dark-eyed man who killed wolves, his answer was often a quiet shaking of the head or hushed silence, as if just evoking his name would somehow bring him back. Even in death, he instilled fear in honest men. That night, while his grown daughter sat in the front row cradling a small guitar, he preached of creators and destroyers, how each man must decide if he will create and be blessed by God, or destroy and be cast into eternal damnation. To the creators he offered hope and salvation. He implored his brethren not to become a destroyer, lest a wolf of the evenings shall spoil them. Every one that goeth out thence shall be torn to pieces, because their transgressions are many, and their backslidings are increased. The sermon was answered with a grateful Amen from the congregation. His daughter Sarah then passed the plate.